Ladies and gentlemen, gender nonconforming and trans deities, thank you for tuning in to the Hoodoisie. So go ahead and grab your favorite alcoholic beverage or not if you are on them 12 steps, and go ahead and chill with us as we bring you another exciting episode of Pandemic Issues. As most of you already know, Pandemic Issues is a weekly series that we're doing in collaboration with the Southside Weekly, in which we give you radical perspectives and analysis and stories that mainstream local media is not. I'm your host, Ricardo Gamboa, or Ricardo Gamboa, or the Radical Selena, as I am known in Europe. And these are my co-hosts. Look who we got. We got Jackie back from Texas. Jackie, go ahead and introduce yourself, even though I guess I kind of did.
What's up, everyone? This is Jackie Serrato, editor-in-chief of the Southside Weekly. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
Boom. And go ahead, Charles, take it away.
This is Charles Preston, Audience Engagement Manager for Injustice Watch and Community Twitter Troll.
Hey, and we are so excited to have our guest this evening for our show, Radical Parenting. Joining us tonight is a journalist that covers race and reproductive health for the nation. We got Dani McClain, give it up, and artist and scholar, the artistic director of Free Street Theater and professor at DePaul University. Let's give it up for Dr. Coya Paz. So we're so happy to have you guys here with the show Radical on Radical Parenting. It's been we've been talking for a while about doing a show on radical parenting, even before COVID-19, and then we really felt that it was important to kind of do one when the pandemic broke out. And so I even made a post like, "Hey, who'd be down with the radical parenting post?" And you know, because in my mind, as like a queer person that has no intention of ever having children, I was like amazed by the amount of people that were like, "Yo!" So we're really excited to be able to have this conversation here. And so, speaking of, both of you are parents. So I just want to just start off with hearing how long you've been a parent and what is one of your favorite, the best moment, what's been your best moment of parenting? And what's been your worst moment? And I'll have 2 sentences for each of these.
You mean like our best and worst moment of parenting during the pandemic, or like ever in the whole?
Either one. It's a choose your own adventure.
Ever. Ever.
Yeah, well, I can start. I have an 11-and-a-half-year-old. So I guess I've been a parent since I was growing her. And my worst moment of parenting is she went through a phase when she was potty training where she loved to play a game we called Where's the Poop? Where she would tell me she had pooped, but it would not ever be in the little potty, so we'd have to to go find it. Like, that's not what I thought I was signing up for when I was parenting, but you know, we learned that parenting is a really visceral experience sometimes. And my best moment of parenting, my child is like such an activist and organizer already. I'm so proud of her, and she really doesn't need me holding her hand. She will go talk to authority figures, organize a petition, start a letter writing campaign all on her own, and that's just really awesome to see her kind of take that into her own hands.
Right, because I remember that Ida actually kind of held a campaign at her school to get rid of the father-daughter dance because it was too gendered, and was like, "Yo, we should have this could be for." I'm saying this right?
Yeah, she spent 3 years organizing to get rid of the daddy-daughter dance, and successful.
Yes, I love that.
Let's hear it, Dani.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep mine to the narrower period of just in recent times in the COVID era. Last weekend, my daughter and I ran through the sprinkler at my mom's house, and it was just sweet, you know. It was she's been doing that, running through the sprinkler, and she's like, "Mom, get in with me." And every time I'm like, "No, I'm not doing it." But this time I made a point of taking my swimsuit, and it was just, you know, this moment gives us an opportunity to explore all the ways that we can experience pleasure in ways that we don't necessarily, you know, always engage in. We have to figure out new ways to have fun and feel joyous. And so that was just a really sweet moment of I'm in my swimsuit in the backyard where I grew up, running through the sprinkler with my kid. And she loves it because she loves when I actually play with her, not when I'm just witnessing her play and encouraging her from afar, but when I'm laughing and jumping and running and all that. So that was a sweet moment recently. The worst part, I was also thinking about that in the context of recent months, I guess. I just hate it every time I this is like a generic answer, but it's true. Like whenever I snap at her or just like use a tone of voice that's just not necessary in that moment, it's really hard to recover from it and be like, I'm just tired. Like I'm just not able to show up for you in a certain way because I'm so exhausted and at wit's end, and I feel a lot of guilt in those moments. So it's a practice of like figuring out how to let that guilt go.
Girl, you could have been a Mexican parent in the 80s and just do that and not feel guilty at all. But I love hearing that.
Or a Black parent, you know, it's like, this is all reprogramming, right? Like this is all figuring out new ways to do what we might have grown up with, at least for me.
Charles, I saw you jumping in for something.
No.
But, so I think
I mean, we can move it along and you know, with these experiences in mind, we can ask, how do both guests define radical parenting? What is radical parenting?
Yo, this is real because someone's like, Ricardo, I just feel like you just put radical in front of anything you do. And they're like, you're like radical turnip farming now, or like some shit like that. And I couldn't respond because they were kind of right. So like, I think it'd be dope to like hear, how are we deciding? And even when we made this title, I was like radical parenting, and someone's like, what does that mean? I was like, you know, like parenting while radical. I don't know. So it'd be dope to hear what you guys' thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I really, it made me think, because I don't really identify with that word. It's not how I would describe my own parenting. I don't like bristle at it. Like I welcome it, but it's not something that I would say. But when I really thought about it, I think about radical the way I always think about it, which is Angela Davis, you know, the Angela Davis definition about radical means grasping at the root. And I think that feels right with regard to parenting, right? It's like, it's about honesty. It's about, in moments of complexity or difficulty, really thinking about like, what is the root of what's happening here? If I'm feeling discomfort, or if I'm feeling in conflict with my child, or if I'm trying to, you know, deal with some knotty issue around like KNOTTY issue around like education or peers or family, you know, interacting with our extended family, like what is actually at the root here that I need to turn and face and be honest about, as opposed to like centering my own comfort and trying to like, you know, be like seeking out ease as opposed to honesty. So that's, to me, what I think radical parenting is.
Yeah, I love that you brought up that sort of definition of radical as being to the root, and really asking like, what am I really trying to address, or what kind of power systems are embedded either in this interaction with my child, or in the ways in which I'm trying to navigate my child through the world or protect my child, and really like trying to learn to unpack that. Because, you know, we were joking about it a minute ago, but the reality is we've inherited so much abusive and problematic behavior that was normalized. And our homes are an opportunity for us to really reimagine what are the structures and relationships we want humans to engage the world with. How do we want them to be loving and open and curious and advocates for each other? And yet we tend to shut that down sometimes, you know, with our children, because it's hard, you know, and we've had a long day and we're just like, can you please just shut up? And you're like, wait, who do we think we should be allowed to say shut up to, you know, or like any of that. But I also think sometimes about like parenting is the most ferocious feeling I've ever had in my life, where I want to protect my child in this way that is really just beyond my brain, you know. And so then I think, how can I translate that desire to protect and care for and advocate for this one tiny human into like humans broadly? And how do I think about engaging in systems of care for children, right? And showing up and making sure that all children in Chicago have access to the same kind of advocacy and care that I want my child to have. And I think too often we think of parenting in a bubble, where like our primary responsibility is to our person. And I really like invite us always to take that opportunity to think about like, how can we make that possible for other people? And how can we show up to support other parents when we know how hard it is and how much harder it can be given the particular mitigating circumstances.
Yeah, is that macaroni, Coya?
Guys, that's Osito, and he is just opinionated on the matter. I apologize.
So thinking about Speaking of opinions, right? Let's talk about principles. What are some of the principles you all have in like your parenting, in your art of parenting or your parenting practice or praxis, as we say in academia? What are the principles of your parenting praxis? It's very what are the radical principles of the radical praxis of your radical parenting? I used it. Whatever it is, you just put radical in front of it. This radical cider I'm drinking is the radical shit, yo.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on that. And I didn't mention this before, but I have one child and she'll be 4 next month. So she's, on the eve of turning 4. And I really appreciate what Coya just said about thinking about like what we want and what we dream for our child or our children, and holding the larger dream for like community children, like that child's peers. When I wrote a book about parenting, about mothering, Black motherhood specifically, and in like my research for it, I read the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who talks about, right, like this her idea, this is something that I learned from reading her work about community mothering, other mothering, like this idea that she roots that, she says that's something that Black mothers have always done because we're always advocating. So if your child's being discriminated against at school, or there's not a playground in your neighborhood, or you can't get appropriate medical care for your child, guess what? There's a dozen other kids right down the block that are in that same situation, right? So that's really one of the principles. I'm not really, the way that I've come into my principles, and I'm growing into them, right? It's not like I embody them fully. I'm like learning them, trying things on, seeing what feels right and what doesn't. But the way that I came into, really knowing what I want for my family is through these interviews that I did for the book. I interviewed dozens of Black mothers and grandmothers, and some of the practices that they shared with me that still really, that I live with and carry with me, are this idea that it's of paramount importance to find community for yourself and for your child. Sorry for the sirens, but that you can't do it on your own, even if you have great, kinship, even if you have a great family. Like, it's not, parenting and raising children is something that you need to do in community. So that's one that I'm constantly trying to figure out, who are the peers that I want her around, who are the people who could be supportive to me. Teaching kids that their bodies are their own. This goes to, again, what we were like joking about earlier, with this question of like, what message am I sending her about bodily autonomy if I put my hands on her and act like that's cool? Because then, like, I want her to know now, like, nobody puts their hands on you, not a teacher at school, not a police officer, not some person who's trying to engage you, sexually in a way that doesn't feel right to you. So I'm trying to share that idea with her now as that also means that your grandparents, like, we as family members need to get consent when we touch you. A lot of times I want to kiss her little cheeks and she's like, I don't want to kiss right now. And I immediately back off and say, that's fine. You don't need to, right? So those are just a few. Choosing schools, where I know, again, to this issue of community, where I know that we as a family are going to be in community with other families who I actually want to organize with, because there will be issues, right? This is like real to me, because like there will be issues. There will be issues with the administration, with teachers, and who do I actually want to stand shoulder to shoulder with when I have to confront those issues? Who's going to have my back? Whose back do I want to have? So those are just a couple of the, the things that I think about in terms of how can I make my parenting more radical, or how can I get to the root of these issues?
Yeah, like, I'm an Aquarius, so I love humanity, but not humans. So I'm just going to homeschool our kid with Sean. And maybe if like Charles and Jackie got kids, they can, because those I don't like to stand next to a lot of people. I don't like crowds. That's not true. I like them when I'm the center of them. So I think, Coya, how about you go in on some principles?
Well, no, I just think it's so true, that like one of the things I have found and found sort of hard to navigate as a parent is that so many of my peers as parents are like, who are the parents of my daughter's schoolmates and other people of children her age. And you end up spending so much time, especially when they're younger, because you have to really supervise with these people that you didn't choose always, and that has been a really hard navigation, where I'll meet like a cool mom and we're talking. And then all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, no, we can't be friends. I really don't see this going much further, So, just navigating the way your whole relationships change. And I love this idea of kind of trying to choose people to organize with. I find that really inspiring, of like, how do you find like the people that you want to show up for and, be there with. I want to echo just everything that Dani said of like, too often we don't teach our children that they have the right to themselves. And so it's very hard then to expect them to go out into the world and navigate it as if they have the right to themselves, because we know schools don't always teach that. So that really has to come from the home and from the support system. And it is sometimes being like, sorry, grandparents, you can't hug them because they don't want that right now. Or like, how do we negotiate it? The other thing, I am really radically transparent with my child here. I'm doing the Ricardo technique of just adding radical to everything. But like, I don't think children are ever too young to begin to engage with a concept. That doesn't mean I'm going to like lay out the whole book. But I think like, I remember one time walking into the room and my daughter had stumbled on Pocahontas and was watching Pocahontas, and I was like, no, we're gonna talk about genocide. Like my partner's like, this child is 3. And I'm like, it is never too soon, because otherwise they're getting a counter message. And like, that's the thing I sort of feel like being a parent, sometimes like playing a video game where society is giving you all of these messages, and like, I remember one time my daughter coming home and being like, Columbus was a really important guy. And I was like, no, give me that worksheet. Like it's sort of this constant deflecting of messaging that, and then sort of explaining, instead of just being like, no, you're going to think this, of really engaging in a process of like, how do you raise them to be critical thinkers with the ultimate goal that they feel comfortable challenging you and kind of meeting you there to push your own thinking.
Yeah, I think this is, it's so bizarre they say, because I'm even thinking about like one of the bigger fights I got into with my dad was when I was playing with my nephew on Thanksgiving a few years ago, and he was like, maybe 1, and I was like, oh, like I don't gender my nephew most of the time, so I was like, oh, look at, they're so cute, and I was like, it's Thanksgiving, say Happy Territorial Expropriation Day. And my dad like flew out of his bedroom and like super upset, but like part of me was like, like, oh, you shouldn't be teaching them. Like, but this child is going to grow up in a world that is constantly telling them that this was some like happy feast, and that already is precluding the erasure of indigenous people. And we know even like, I think it's at 3 months that kids can already start recognizing racial or 3 years or stuff like that. It's like they start I'm just going to give a fake fact.
It's in infancy. It is in infancy.
It is in infancy.
Sure.
They can start recognizing race and things like that. And so I'm just like, yo, like, no, it's imperative that we constantly talk about this stuff. So I was right, is what I'm realizing when I hear you guys talk. But the other part of it that I'm also thinking about is, but it reminds me of something that Dani said, which was like when I was made a joke about parents in the 80s, and like Dani's like, well, and Black parents, and it's about a lot of unlearning. And so thinking about that, even when you think about the principles that you have, like what are the ones that, when you think about older generations of parenting or even your own parents, you're like, I am most different because, you know what I mean? Or I diverge from this way because. I like how both of you are like, oh, I could talk about this shit.
The first thing that comes to mind is I am really playing with a willingness to say like, I don't know. When I really don't know, instead of basically the larger issue is like, I'm trying to be okay with not always presenting myself as being in control.
Right.
So that means like, if I don't know something and it's like complex, or like, why are these people doing that? Like, I don't know. It's like, it's the, this is a kind of weird example, but like my daughter, this was deep. This was, it was like in February, and we were driving someplace and she was in the car seat. She was looking out the window, and all of a sudden she was like, Mom, when are the days gonna end? And I was like, what? And she's like, when are there gonna be no more days? And I was like, that's the question everybody wants to know. And I even used this word. I was like, that is the existential question that all people want to know. I was like, you just tapped into like the question we all don't know and want to know, right? So I'm like, as opposed to saying like, oh, like life will go on forever or whatever, like some kind of rosy understanding of like human existence, right? I also am trying to get comfortable with like crying in front of her. I have kind of mixed feelings around it, because I do think kids want to know that they're safe. There's like this question of like, how in control do I, like, I want her to know that I have her and I have us and she's safe. And also I want the space to like cry when I'm grieving, or just kind of like have a range of emotional expression without feeling like it all needs to seem like tamped down and under control so that she thinks that everything's rosy all the time. I don't know how to do that well, but I'm like testing it out. I'm trying. Yeah. So that's like one, those are things that I'm like kind of playing with at this point.
Yeah, I cry regularly in front of my boyfriend, but that's because I want attention and I make up the reasons sometimes. I heard that's not the healthiest way to go about, so I'm trying to be better. Coya.
Well, you know, I was thinking to what Dani was saying, is like, there's something so strange about parenting is I feel like there's always this doubling of like, you're in your feelings, which you have every right to be, and you want to model that like healthy expression of, you know, negative of feeling, you know, like not always just happy, but you also kind of have to be in a teaching mode, even at the same time of like contextualizing it, you know, and like, you're still safe, or, you know, I care for you, mommy is sad because of this, you know, and like, it's just a constant doubling. And like, you know, that's what leads us to like lock ourselves in the bathroom after they go to sleep and be like, oh God, you know, like, and so, you know, I think about with my parents, I have this situation where my parents are movement people. You know, I grew up in the quote unquote movement where my parents were, you know, they're leftists and they're radicals and they're organizers and activists. But I don't think, you know, with great love and respect to my parents, they did an awesome job sort of helping me become a critical thinker and a political organizer and all these things. But those principles didn't make it into our home. You know, like you know, my parents certainly used corporeal punishment. You know, my mom would yell at me and then pretend like that never happened. You know, she'd be like, I don't know what you're talking. I didn't say that. And I'm like, you 100% said that, you know, whereas like with my daughter, I certainly have snapped at her, and certainly the pandemic, you know, like anytime you're like at home, it's like this petri dish. It's so hard not to just, I guess you don't explode in a petri dish. I'm an artist, not a scientist. So, you know, but then anytime I've ever yelled at her, I try to contextualize that for her. That I acted, you didn't make me do that. I did not behave appropriately. You know, my parents never did stuff like that. You know, my parents would make me, I grew up in Ecuador, so you greet every single person with a kiss. And like, there's no, if I didn't choose to kiss some random old guy I never even met in my life on the cheek, hello and goodbye, I would be sent to my room with no dinner. That was a strange punishment to like be like, and now I will not feed you. It's like, I think about, or even my parents saying things like, you have to clean your plate. And you like, my mom went through this phase where she would refeed me the same food every single meal until I ate it. I look back on that, I'm like, what do you care? Like, talk to me about food scarcity then. What's the real concern here about my behavior, you know? And so I just like, I find myself really like, there's a lot of comedy to mine from that, but like the disjuncture between what they were trying to change in public life and the way things worked in private life is so sort of curious to me in retrospect.
Mm-hmm. So during the pandemic with the stay-at-home order, a lot of families have been kind of forced to, you know, interact more with each other and, you know, be in close quarters. How has the dynamics with your children changed? And how do you explain to them some of the just things that are happening nationally and locally, socially and politically?
So let's see, my daughter was in preschool this past school year for her first year of preschool. She was 3. So school was out as of mid-March. So, you know, as has been the case with most kids. And so I am in some ways very privileged position because, so I'm unpartnered, a single mom. I reject that phrase, but I'm an unpartnered, you know, parent. I live in this house with my daughter. But my mom lives about 25, 30 minutes away, and she is a really important resource for us. So I never accepted that whole like public health guidance around like whoever lives in your household, go in the house and shut the door. Because I immediately was like, no, that's not how our family works. Like that's not my family. My family lives between at least 2 houses. You can make an argument we live among like several houses, if you include like her dad and her paternal grandparents and stuff like that. So immediately my mom and I just like potted up, which means that my daughter really never stopped going to her house for childcare. So I feel really lucky in that respect, because I talked to these parents who've literally been just them and their kids for like 4 months. And I just, that wasn't an option for us. How have I explained to her what's going on? Well, how has it changed the dynamic? I mean, even though we do have an outlet, and even though she spends time at another home, you know, we do spend more time together. I just explained, you know, I'm a big public radio listener. And so like back in January, February, every morning when I would take her to school, I'd be listening to NPR and they'd be talking about the coronavirus in China at that point, or like, I guess, Italy. So the word was very familiar to her, and she would be like, what is that? And I was like, it sounds so like ridiculous in retrospect, since we had to hear this from our own top government officials, but I was like, it's like the flu, but worse, I think. So she understood early on that there was a disease that has kind of moved across the world. I don't know if she understands the concept of the world. I think maybe. So yeah, it's been an explanation around, we can't get close to people. You have to keep a distance, you know. I don't know how much she really comprehends. But I feel the same way about adults. I don't really see like, I think her struggles to understand have been very comparable to what I see in like some adults who I interact with, who I think are also struggling to understand. Like I'm lightweight clowning, but not really. Like I think
it's real.
This is like, we're all kind of like, so you can't breathe on someone, or like first they said surfaces and now they say surfaces are okay. I think she is trying to grasp what's going on. My daughter is a rule follower. That's been one big insight through all this. Like, because I'll get her around other 3-year-olds and I see their parents are just like, whoa, like the kid's not keeping on a mask. The kid has no understanding of social distance. My child understands social distance for sure. And so it's been, I don't really struggle to like, you know, have her follow the rules, because she's just, I don't know, that's kind of like part of her personality, I guess. I think she's an only child and she's around like grown people all the time. So she is used to kind of like mimicking adults or doing what adults say, as opposed to following younger peers. But yeah, it's been, you know, and I'm happy to talk about how I've explained to her kind of the larger social issues of what's going on in the world with like the rebellion and police violence.
I was about to ask,
violence.
Yeah, because again, even like kind of like I'm thinking about like having a 4-year-old child, right? Like, because you said that your child's she's gonna be 4 in a month. Like, is that a point like where as a parent you're like, I want to protect them from this type of stuff at that age, because they're gonna have especially as a Black child, they're gonna have their whole life to be confronted with this,
right? Exactly.
Or is it a moment where you're like, no, this is the time to talk about this, you know?
Right. That's exactly so. Okay. I appreciate that acknowledgement that this might be a different conversation for Black children, or for children in communities that are constantly that will know white supremacy like early on, right? For whom it's not like some concept that they need to be kind of taught, right? So what I did, the way it kind of happened in our house is George Floyd was killed. I didn't say anything to her about it, even as the uprising was building in Minneapolis. And then the uprisings went nationwide, and I was like glued to my phone. This is one to your question about like, what's the dynamic like in the house? One thing I've had to struggle with is like, I've kind of given up on any limits around screen for myself, not so much for her. I still kind of like try to keep her, but for myself, I'm just like, I need to look at Twitter right now. Sorry. Like, I'm just gonna be over here scrolling. So once the rebellions started breaking out all over the country, I was just like, I can't look away. Like, I need to just know what's happening. And so she was like, Mom, too much screen. What's going on? I was like, okay, look at this. You see these signs say Black Lives Matter. These people, the police hurt somebody, and all these people around the country are upset about it. And so they're going into the streets and they're telling the police and they're telling their neighbors that they don't want to deal with this anymore. And then I was able to refer to some books that we have, like some children's books. We have this book called We March that's basically about the March on Washington, but it teaches kids about like, this is what do people do when they're preparing for a march? You make signs together, you sing together, you move through the streets together. We have this book called Island Born by Juno Diaz. I know he's like controversial, but I really love this children's book. It's about like organizers in the Dominican Republic, basically. It doesn't like name it, but it's about this little girl learning about the elders in her family and community who were organizers and who defeated this dictator. And so she's also learned about organizing a bit from that book. And then we have this book about Rosa Parks. So I was able to point to these children's books and be like, this is what's happening now. These things that we've read about happening in the past or happening in other countries, like this is happening right now here. And she really got that. But then I was really challenged because I was explaining police violence as like a consent issue. I was like, the police touched somebody's body the way they shouldn't have. And she's like, why? And I was like, they just did. And I was like, this isn't good. Like, I don't know this part yet. Because I wasn't ready to be like, the police killed somebody. I don't know why. I just wasn't. It's because of what you said. It's like, Stacia Brown, I love her writing on Black motherhood. She wrote this great piece for The Cut that was kind of grappling with this. It's like, when your Black kid is going to know about white supremacy and know about death soon enough, can you just give them a little bit of protected time?
Right.
You know? So I was feeling that, but then I started joining workshops. There's a group in Oakland called Abundant Beginnings that does basically like liberatory teaching of kids starting at like 1 and 2. And
Wow.
they were doing through the ages of like preteen, you know? And they did this workshop in early June called We Keep Us Safe. And first it was for families, and then it was for children. They did this workshops for kids of different ages. And I was like, I need to know how they do it. And so I sat through their workshops and I learned that they had this whole thing. They teach about the white supremacy fairy, and that they talk about the white supremacy fairy sitting on the cop's shoulder, and that's sitting on the cop's boss's shoulder and the boss's shoulder, and that's called the system. And I was like, this is so amazing, right? So I'm learning all these methods of how you talk to a young person about white supremacy and state violence. And I'm only repeating this. This is Abundant Beginnings work. I'm reporting a story about how people teach young people about police violence. And I want to credit them because this is their pedagogy. But I say that just to say that I'm in a state of learning, both as a reporter and as a parent, and I'm testing things out to see what will work in my family and what won't.
Yo, that is so, I love, now I'm gonna start saying white supremacist fairy all the time. And that does not mean gay white nationalists, okay? It means the fictional thing. Coya, I see you revving up.
Well, I love fairies, but not
Right.
white supremacy fairies. You know, I think it's very different in my family because, you know, I do think all the time about, you know, children of color, but especially Black children. I feel like, you know, we know over and over again, we see like studies about how people read Black children as older than they are and just like more responsible than they are. And I just really feel like how, you know, it's so important to protect the sense of possibility that sometimes comes with childhood for as much as possible. But, you know, I think with my daughter, who has a very complicated kind of cultural and ethnic mix, but she looks white, as do I, you know, and so we move in the world in this certain way that I feel like we can't let ourselves off the hook on, you know. So I have always contextualized whiteness for her and sort of tried to talk about, you know, what it is to have the responsibility to challenge whiteness as a white person. And I
What
think
does that look like, Coya? Like, are you like, and you're white, mamas? Like,
yeah, just like that. You know, well, no parent wants their child to feel shame, you know, so
Right.
That's where I think it's important, you know, like there's so much about her cultural background that's beautiful and special. And I think like one of the keys of dismantling white supremacy is to recognize it as a structure that shapes the conditions of all of our lives, including white people, you know, and that to her, like what she's granted by whiteness is different than her cultural heritage, which has to do with her immigrant grandparents and great grandparents. And, you know, like, how do we love a cultural heritage and not love white supremacy and sort of recognize where white supremacy is showing up in our interactions, you know? So like one of the things I've been grappling with myself is like, my whole life I've been told I'm smart, I'm exceptional, I'm talented. And like, it's so tempting to believe those things about yourself, but all of us want to be smart, exceptional, talented.
But what if you are smart?
You are.
I'm playing.
And yet sort of thinking about like how much of that is afforded by my whiteness. Do you know what I mean? Like how many people could have been the smart, exceptional, talented ones that all the teachers are like, I believe in you, or whatever it is, or let's nominate you, or whatever, you know? And so like with my child, it's more about like, how do I keep her feeling like she has a right to herself, that she is an important person because all people are important, not because she is particularly important, but that we are all, you know, that navigating all of these are complicated conversations, but they're not impossible ones, you know, of sort of like, and I think that she's really, really good at parsing that, you know, and like we talk a lot about like, we live in Humboldt Park, which is a, you know, a gentrifying neighborhood. But she goes to school in Lakeview, which is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Chicago. I'm just contextualizing this for Dani a little bit. You know, anyone in Chicago is like, oh, we know what you're talking about here. And so she would go to her little friends' houses and they're like living in literal mansions, you know, and then she would come back to our like perfectly fine 2-bedroom apartment in a classic Chicago 2-flat, you know. And she'd be like, Mommy, why are we so poor? And I'm like, man, we're not even close to poor. Is that those people are disproportionately wealthy. And here's why they're disproportionately wealthy. And here's how wealth is maintained. You know, and like, we've just been having those conversations for a really long time because I can't let her normalize, you know, and whiteness or wealth as the default. It's not. So they're very different conversations to have though.
Right. I mean, so it's weird because you all are talking about how you're teaching your kids, but the reality is like, right, children go to school. And right now, I'm thinking about even like in CPS that's announced that they are going to be reopening schools, that, you know, it's complete, you know, it's fine if we take these type of precautions, right? And so I guess one of the questions is like in, you know, as like, you know, for Coya, I would say like as a mom, that's like a, you know, as a mom of a CPS student, you know, what's your understanding of, you know, of this plan? And I know, I'm sure Dani, like even when you know, as well, like how are you guys feeling around the reopening of schools? I guess I would say kind of more generally before we hone in on anything more specific.
So, okay. It sounds like what it sounds like what the big school district here, Cincinnati Public Schools, is doing is similar to what Chicago Public Schools is doing, like a mix of like a hybrid where kids will go some days in person and some days. Okay, so we're not in CPS yet. My daughter's in a preschool that's connected to a university. And my plan, and they are going to do the same thing where it's like a mix where they're supposed to be there for 2 days and then home doing virtual learning for 2 days. We had got a taste of virtual learning in the spring, and like virtual learning for a 3-year-old, it's nice because she gets to see her friends and her teachers who she really feels connected to. So, but is it the same experience? The whole point of preschool is socialization, right? And so she's an only child. Preschool is very important to me because, you know, it's funny. She's an only child and she doesn't have any first cousins. I'm an only child, but my first cousins were like my siblings. So I don't feel like an only child, right? She's like really, really an only. So preschool is very important to me because I was like, you got to have some friends who are your age and not just be sitting here like up under me and your grandmother sounding like 70-year-old Black women, which she kind of does. I mean, yeah. So we're going to go for it. You know, she's going to go back. My personal kind of expectation is that things are going to get really tricky when flu season starts. Flu season was tough on us last year. She was sick kind of constantly between October and December. And I think with COVID in the mix, it's going to be hard to tell what's a flu symptom and what's a COVID symptom. And so I feel very prepared to just be like, we're not doing this anymore if I start to feel too nervous about sending her. What that said, she's going to a camp right now that is very much like a preschool situation, because it feels like infection rates are stable right now in Hamilton County where we live. And I feel like she should get the socialization in while she can, because who knows what the fall is going to bring. But speaking more broadly, I would say that, you know, I'm like following these conversations about homeschool pods. I see a lot of parents saying like, well, these districts don't know what they're talking about, so we're just going to keep our kid, we're going to get a group of parents together, keep our kids out of school and hire a private tutor that we use to work with our kids. And then we as parents will maybe rotate helping the kids with homework or doing this or that. And I'm interested to see how that plays out. I mean, there are already a lot of questions around who's that actually going to work for? What does that mean if you don't have the money to pay to like throw down on a private tutor? Your job isn't flexible, so you can't be one of those parents who helps out with, you know, whatever, watching the kids 2 days a week. There are a ton of issues around that. Also, kids who have access needs and get services provided through their public school district in a way that like a tutor or homeschooling just isn't going to work for them. So I'm curious to see. How that stuff is going to play out. There are a couple more thoughts that I have about school, but I'm interested to see what Coya has to say, and maybe if I remember them, I can come back to it.
Yeah, Chicago is having, Chicago hasn't decided, but they have proposed that students will go to school 2 days. They'll either be a Monday, Tuesday group or a Thursday, Friday group, and Wednesday is the cleaning time. And I don't feel great about it. I am really disappointed that we haven't, everybody is talking about like, we should never go back to normal. We shouldn't, this is our opportunity to change everything. And I would have really loved to see CPS, not that I really expected this to happen in Chicago, but I would have loved to see CPS be much more creative about where we really need the like super investment, a child like mine, she is, first of all, she's 11. She's going into the 6th grade. She's pretty self-contained. If you give her a worksheet or a book or an activity, she'll do it. That wasn't the case several years ago where she needed a lot of hands-on supervision. And I really feel for caregivers and parents who are juggling their jobs, multiple children, younger children, children who need a lot of supervision for whatever reason. It is an almost impossible situation. And I would have loved to see us take a more creative approach to where we're investing our resources. I'm so resistant to the idea of pods for the upper middle class and for the privileged, and I think that's where we're seeing as people are organizing and closing and thinking about what they can get for their kids and their friends' kids, that this isn't an effort to match with families of saying like, hey, I have time and money and resources and can pay for this private tutor. Who doesn't have that? And how could I share that investment? And so one of the things I've really been thinking about, I run a theater company, or I'm one of the directors of a theater company, where our commitment is citywide, and really thinking about how do we use the arts to address social issues and to show up in communities that don't always have formal investment from funders and from the city and things like that. And like, how can we organize artists and teaching, people who are teaching artists and who are maybe like extras teachers, you know what I'm talking about? Like, who is where? How could we be organizing to show up for and supplement for children across the city? I would have, who really needs to be in a classroom? How can we kind of clear the number of teachers and where they are? At the same time, I'm hearing from teachers, many of them, that they're so scared to go back into the classroom. So there's also a labor issue. There was that study from Korea that just came out this week showing that, yes, it's true that children under 10 are less likely to get or transmit COVID, but not zero. But 11 and up, it is the same as with adults. And so like, I look at my 11-year-olds and I'm like, so I'm sending her to Petri dish. Right. The reality too is when we think about the ways in which even masking and social distancing has become politicized, it's also racialized when you think about who thinks they're at risk and who's not, who thinks they're clean, is offended by the idea of a mask, is so much these like upper middle class white people, especially in Chicago. And that's exactly who my daughter goes to school with. Apologies to any parents from her school who might be listening.
No, fuck them. You tell them, Coya. You tell them. She means you.
Tell them. I mean, many of them. But we went to an end of school year picnic that was touted to me as like we'd all be like socially distanced on our blankets with our families, we'd wave at the teachers, do a parade. And no, we got there, none of the men, none of those dads, white men, were wearing masks. They were like walking up to children, clapping them on the shoulder, like talk. And I was like, oh my God, what is happening You need to get away from my child. And I think too, like my child has really severe asthma. And thinking about all of the times where we've had to take her to the ER because she had a cold that complicated. And then I think about how asthma is a lethal disease that is really easily controlled with the right expensive medication. It's incredibly common. Something like 20% of youth in cities have it. It disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. We know that it is affected and made worse by environmental issues that tend to disproportionately affect the Black and brown areas of our city. And I think about like the kind of health risk that we have already not been addressing with so many of our young people. What are we doing to really protect them? Very little. I had to fight to get my daughter to be able to carry an inhaler on her person instead of waiting for the nurse who's only sometimes there. Like this little tiny piece of plastic medicine that will save her life or not save her life. You know what I mean? And just thinking about how that's been a struggle. So I'm incredibly reluctant to send my child back. At the same time, I know like there are people who desperately need that, and we could be more creative in how we're thinking about it. But we can't leave that up to the city. It really has to be us organizing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like weird, like hearing this thing about the pods, right? Like, and then who gets to organize with those pods and things like that. It really kind of lets you know how like the family becomes like this unit, right? Of like that in which the personal and the political really converge, and then the kind of like individual, right, and the collective kind of inverge, because it's about that individual parent that thinks it's okay to model a total disregard, right, for social distancing that then gets passed on. And then at the same time, right, it is about like the inheritance. The family is is the unit. We always talk about the structural elements of white supremacy, and so we think of policy and things like that, administrative thing. But like that's a very clear example of the family as a unit in which white privilege and white supremacy is something that's inherited and something that is learned in a very intimate domestic space, right? Those like, and it's funny because like you can't see white liberal parents like organize against the police, right? Like, but you will see them kind of like get together to be like, yo, our kids need to have pods. And really what they're saying is our kids, you know, we need to remanufacture the privilege that our children usually have because they go to better schools like in Lakeview or things like that because they gentrified the neighborhood there. And we need to make sure that we could remanufacture it to endure this kind of crisis. Maybe this is actually not that novel of a point, right? I'm just basically saying like white privilege gets passed on in this generation.
But I think it's complex because right. Like, I don't know that it is only white people doing this, right? Because one resource that I lean really heavily into right now is my like all of us, my group chats, right? And these are, most of my friends are kind of all over the country. And I'm, you know, a lot of my close friends, folks in DC and New York and the Bay. And a lot of them are talking about, you know, these are like middle-class Black people who are like, yo, like, we can't trust these districts. We can't trust these institutions. We have to do this for ourselves. And, and then like so I am seeing it among like middle-class Black folks, right? But like one of my favorite people who I recently got turned on to is Akilah S. Richards, who's a Black homeschool or deschooling advocate, who this precedes the pandemic, right? But she has long been talking about like, don't put your kids in these schools. Like, do not send your kids to these schools, right? I just did an interview with Ashley Herring, a Black woman in the Boston area, who's this past school year was her first year being part of a homeschool co-op with other Black families. So I'm just a little hesitant, only because I don't know. I very much get the narrative, and like I can imagine that these conversations are like playing out among middle class and upper class white people. And I'm curious about how it is playing out for Black people and people of color, because I think we are also having this conversation. Hopefully, maybe we're engaging it in a different way. Maybe we're asking ourselves some of these questions around access and like how can we include folks who like don't have as much privilege, but it's ripe for reporting, right? Because a lot of what I'm basing this off of is like these Facebook threads. Like somebody in the Bay posted a Facebook post that like blew up and went viral, and then people are like reposting her thing and commenting on it. But yeah, that's one way of kind of getting a sense for what's happening. And then there's like I'm curious about doing some interviews to talk to folks about how they're trying to figure this out for themselves.
I'm so curious because I'm wondering if, like, you know, and I believe, like, right, like I don't believe like brown people, black people, indigenous people are above critique, right? And we definitely know that there's been a lot of times where people of color or racialized minorities, like when they can access like power, have not always been great, been the best stewards of their community or things like that. But I was, you know, I think a lot about the work of like David Stovall, who used a lot of the conversations around prison abolition to talk about what does it mean to abolish something like normative and institutional education, right? Because if we believe that these institutions are never kind of like looking out for us. And so I'm wondering like how much of, because I agree, I'm thinking about some more kind of middle-class brown parents, but how much of the conversation is about like, yes, like these institutions are fucked up and like, you know, and around access, and let's talk about this. Whereas when I think about one of the things, that trend that we've been seeing, I think, in white supremacy and whiteness kind of more broadly is like, you know, one of the promises that capitalism made and that the US made was that it was a space for everyone. And one of the things that we've seen white people and white supremacy say is like, now it's trying to get away from that promise. It's actually saying, no, this is not the country for everyone, right? And so how much of those parents organizing is at a cellular level being like, you can have those schools. That's not what we're doing. You know what I mean? Which is always going to be a different thing when you think about like the school to prison pipeline that like Black and brown youth have been the victims to. So it's so weird because like it could be like I guess what I'm like getting like this, my brain is going like this. Because I feel like it's like, oh, this is what, like, yes, it's these two people with resources like having this conversation, but then it diverges because maybe there's different dynamics underpinning it. But yeah, I mean, but I also know some snobby ass Latinos that are like, oh, I'm not. It's almost even that they get to embody that privilege by actually saying, I'm not sending my kids back to that, if that makes sense. And so like, you know, I'm just gonna have another sip of my radical cider right now. I'm taking a radical sip of my radical cider.
It is about like how sort of access to financial resources plays out in these pods, because the idea of like collectively caring for each other's children is not new, and it's certainly not the purview of white people. You know, like I'm thinking about when my daughter was young, and I worked full time. The nature of my job is I didn't have maternity leave, so I worked, you know, took like 2 weeks off, and I was right back in a meeting. And so the people that showed up for me the hardest in terms of like, here, give me your kid, I can take your kid for the afternoon, were like mostly working class Latinas, I would say. Like, and that is, it tends to be like most of my community that I hang out with day to day is Latinx, right? And so thinking about how people were already taking care of somebody's cousin, somebody's niece, their neighbor's friend, sure, drop her off, we'll take care of her. And like, there was already a culture of community care. So I know that we're seeing that. And I know we're also seeing that for some young people, being away from schools gives them an opportunity to be themselves, to express themselves, to ask questions that are not possible in the institution, to follow their interests, to read what they want to read, to sleep when they want to sleep and wake up and study when they want to. I think that there's so much about the structure of the school that's set up to prepare them for factory jobs or prisons that is not liberatory for our children. My concern is just like, how will resources cement? And we know that in Chicago in particular, the public school teachers have been going hard to advocate for students, you know, and to really say we need to reallocate resources and we need to think, you know, I feel teachers had a rough year with that long strike and then going into remote learning, and like the ways in which like so many teachers are desperately trying to hold on to resources for students who won't get those resources through private means. And so then my question to parents who have money, regardless of their racial identification, is like, why are you consolidating that money for this tiny group of people? Because spending a lot of time with white liberals, they imagine themselves to be racially progressive, do you know? And then, you know, and one thing I will say, like, I'll call myself out in that, nothing has revealed my hypocrisies more than being a parent. Because like in theory, should children go in a gentrifying neighborhood? Should my child go to her local school? Absolutely. Does my child go to her local school? No. You know, and like that decision making, you know, ultimately I chose a school next to my office so that I could pop out, get her, and come back to work. It was a labor question. But it also means that my time, my economics is not funneled into my local PTA. And I think that's a real thing to grapple with. And, you know, I'm always trying to hold that mirror up to myself and to others.
I kind of want to dive into really quick. So, quick question. Speaking of like consent and learning to modeling boundaries and things like that, it's 8:29, and we stop at 8:30. Do you all mind if we go on for another 15 minutes? And by 15, I probably really mean 18.
I'm fine with 18 more minutes.
Okay. So, Coya, you good?
Yeah.
So I guess I want to kind of dive into this question because it's like I think for so long we've heard when we talking about parenting and motherhood specifically is what does it mean to straddle both being a working mom and being the working element of being a working mom and the mom. And so both of you are kind of like these, I mean, we're so excited to have you on the show. Like Dani, you're an amazing journalist, author. Coya, you're an amazing scholar, practitioner, radical practitioner of radical art. And so I think one of the things I'm thinking about is like, how have you seen those skills kind of like applied? Like Dani, I think when you were speaking with our editorial producer, you talked about kind of like media literacy and having to be kind of navigate truth with your, with your child and at home and for your family, even that's quarantining with you. And for Coya, when I'm thinking about you, you're one of the only theater companies that I will work with in the entire city of Chicago and that I call my home precisely because like Free Street has the radical theater, Free Street has a radical politics towards radical theater and where they, and I'm thinking about, we go off of ensemble traditions. It's the only theater I know that offers childcare to actors that we get from working class communities so that they can actually be in rehearsals. How have you even seen kind of that radical world making, and have you applied it at all at home? So Dani, we could start, I was going to toss it back to you. That was a really long and convoluted question, but sorry.
No, that's a great question. So it's interesting because I was thinking about this when Coya was talking about like, what does it mean when like these pods are consolidating resources for a private, private group of families. And I was thinking about what a lot of people aren't, don't have any, forethought, that's not the word, but people aren't looking ahead to think, what might the federal government do with this, right? Is like, well, is this going to create an opening for Betsy DeVos to be like, I guess y'all don't need public schools anymore because so many people have like exited the system, right? And so one of the reasons that people might not be thinking about this is that there's so much chaos at the top. I mean, this moment requires so much of us, right? There's like a total abdication of responsibility within the federal government. There's so much responsibility falling to families to make sense of so much public health information and really to like decide, how are we going to survive this? Because no one's coming to save us, right? For those people who still thought someone was coming to save you, now nobody's coming to save you for the most part. A lot of us have known that for a long time. A lot of us have known like nobody's ever coming to save you. For some people, it's like the recent kind of wake up call. Okay, so a related point. Chaos at the top means stress in our families. And one of the ways that I personally have experienced this is around taking in information about how to stay safe. And I feel, because I am a news hound, because my whole job is to be glued to the interwebs all day, figuring out things and like sussing out story ideas and kind of staying up to date on public discourse. I've read the new report out of Korea about children under 10 the second the Times publishes it, right? I've read the kind of like, hospitals are no longer reporting their data to the CDC, they're reporting it to DHHS. Like that's less of that's more of a policy issue than like a news you can use. But the flood of information that we have to read about, okay, initially, are we supposed to be wearing masks or not? They said don't get masks because it might create a shortage for the frontline medical workers. Okay, well, I have to make a decision now about, should my family be wearing masks? Do you wipe down everything with Clorox before you bring your groceries in the house? How do you clean your house? How do you sanitize? Those of us who are very media literate and who have kind of a way of thinking about what is credible sources of information and news versus what is not, we have a leg up in this moment. And I have really experienced this challenge around, I'm in family with and like close community with people who don't necessarily share the same sources of news and information. And there have been really challenging moments around like, look, this is what we need to do to stay safe. well, I don't believe that, you know, or like that, you know, what is Bill Gates going to do with the vaccine? And I'm just going to be real. Like a lot of us pretend that we don't have anti-vaxxers in our families and stuff, and we want to dismiss it as like Hotep, this and that. And it really upsets me because like, yo, like these are our family members.
Yo, Dani, my favorite thing is I was like, me and Charles were talking like after we were at our friend Roy's like listening party, and I was like, you know, I'm like, they're like a Latin Mexican Hotep, and Charles goes, an Aztec, and it was that thing that I've been using.
Yo, y'all, that's a good one. Y'all need to that. But this is real, and I feel like this moment that has been something where it's like we can't just write these people off and be like, oh, you know, anti-vaxxers and like this and that. It's like, no, we actually have to be in conversation with these folks about how to stay safe together. And that has been a real part of my life.
Don't say that, because I feel like it makes me feel bad, because what I do when my family members say something racist or stupid is I block them.
Right. Yeah, but if you have to co-parent with somebody, or you have to, you know what I'm saying, or you have to, and so I'm just gonna say this, and I'm gonna stop talking about it. But I have learned a lot, because it's also really, it's been good for me too. Because what I've realized is like, just slow down, don't discount people. One of the privileges I have as somebody whose job it is to sit here at my computer all day is that I'm reading this stuff. You know, for some people it takes a while to like take in the information, sort it out. What do they really think? Like, have they heard it from enough of their friends that it's like you know, that there's like critical mass around this particular way of approaching COVID? Okay, now I believe it. And so I have really learned to like slow down and really be in conversation with and listen to people's perspectives. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. It's hard when you feel like it's life or death, right? It's like, I don't have time to kind of like sort this out with you. Like, we might die if we're exposed.
See, you have you are like perfectly embodying like the Black feminist ethics of care. I have like the Latino faggotry ethics of I don't got fucking time for your bullshit. And I love it because
right. Have a kid.
Right.
Well, I was thinking like that's so much how parenting is too, you know, because like so often it's not that effective to just be to your kid like, no, you're wrong. You have to be like, so what makes you think that? Oh, interesting. And where did you see that? And part is because we're taking notes, like, you will never watch that show again. So help me, you know, or like, I need to call the teacher, you know, like some of it is information gathering, but a lot of it is like trying to get them to switch their mindset so that the next time they encounter a thing, they know how to encounter a thing, you know? And so it's sort of the same, you know, this sort of generosity and patience we have to bring to our parenting is also useful as an organizing tool. Like we don't just like, movements are not built by like telling people they're wrong, pushing them out. It's by saying like, hey, you're so close, but I feel like I would like you to come this way a little bit more, or like you're very far away. Let's get you in, you know, because otherwise we just end up with sort of a divisiveness that's impossible to bridge. Now, I will say, I would like to acknowledge that Ricardo and I have a long-running, decades-long argument about whether to build a bridge or burn a bridge. And I think you can guess who goes on which side of that.
But the thing that I'm thinking about is what I think is real is like when you just talked about the politics of the home, like making it the politics, public politics coming into private politics, is that like, you know, working in like brown communities, immigrant communities, Black communities, right? Like I've had students living with me that were still working through their homophobia, you know what I mean? Like, and things like that. And so like, I feel like, or working in communities where I know like, I'm like, you go to the church the storefront church every day that says someone like me should go to hell, but we're still going to work together. And I'm going to find a way to have compassion and hope that you can too. And then I go to bars and get online and I'm like, I don't have that same politics. Right. You know what I mean?
But you don't have the same relationship to them. You know, right. Like I actually think it's much harder to excise people. And it should be much harder to excise people when you are in a community with them and you have deep connections and roots to them. That doesn't mean that sometimes, you know, in the context of family, you have to make decisions for self-preservation, but often a political discussion is not inherently about self-preservation. It's more about being annoyed or frustrated and learning to recognize when something. Yes.
So we have like a few more minutes, and so just really quick, what is like and a couple minutes each of you maybe, just so we can make sure we're on time, and after that we'll go into updates and a Rona reflection. And I know whenever we have parents on the show, they're like, they're like texting me in the chat window, like my 3-year-old is crying right now. I'm like, go. So if you gotta log off, you gotta log off. But what is something we haven't talked about that you're like, I don't want to hang up this I don't want to get off this show without mentioning this. And while you think about it, I'll make a dance for the people right now. Hey.
I'll share something I'm excited about. Is that okay? Or like, you mean something?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a big fan of Allied Media Conference, and it kicks off tomorrow.
Yes.
And, if you've attended, like, I've been going for the past 20 years. It's online, obviously this year, I think like over 5,000 people are registered, but so much of what we've talked about tonight around like community care and what does it mean to want for, all of us, what we want for our individual families. And I'm part of a panel on Saturday morning from 11 to 12:30 that's called Care for the Future. That's going to be with a bunch of amazing people. Hopefully it's getting shared in the, maybe the link to it is getting shared, but I'm just excited. Laura Limbal, who did this movie Into the Night, which is about this 24-hour childcare center, is one of the panelists. Vera Lucia Mendoza, who organized the mutual aid group in Toledo, who's just like this dope person connected to Mi Gente and like a bunch of other incredible organizations. And Leah Lakshmi, who is a disability justice organizer and scholar. So it's going to be, if you want to hear more of this conversation about like caregiving and kind of how do we think about it beyond the family unit, even more broadly, it's going to be a great thing to tune into.
That's awesome. We'll be sharing all that information. I'm sure Yasmin, our editorial producer, and Janie, our social media manager, have been sharing. I've seen them been sharing the book, your book and articles and like everything in the comment thread right now, and the books you've been mentioning. So that's cool. And then Coya, one thing that you want to talk about before we
I think it's similar, of thinking about like sometimes, you mentioned at Free Street, we offer childcare at rehearsals, at shows, because we don't want having to find a babysitter to be the barrier to accessing participating in theater or attending theater. And I think we can pull that same thing over to our organizing. Like when I was a young parent, a parent of a young child, I was really acutely aware of the ways when I felt welcome as a parent and when I felt I was burdening, and I think that we can really, I would love to see more spaces kind of rethink how they're accommodating childcare and elder care into sort of when we meet, for how long we meet, what's our expectations about noise. Like one of our rules at Free Street, children are always welcome, but they're welcome as children. And so the people that need to make the adjustment are adults. Like this child is not going to be quiet, like we need to breathe through it. We're the ones who can be patient and to like redirect or give them a chalk or, that we need to as a community, because these are the very children that will grow up to be taking care of us. Like the people we're seeing at the front line of protests right now are engaged in an active community care, and so like they're very young, many of them, when did they become politicized? Who made space for them? What would have happened if people made space for their parents? And probably people did, I don't know their life, but just really thinking about like how we just like think about community care, and making movement spaces accessible to parents and caregivers of small children.
I love that, like the people that need to adjust because children are going to be children, except when you're on an airplane. I advocate very strongly for flights for just families. Koya's just shaking her head at that joke. She's like, I'm not even gonna validate it with a laugh. But it's real
really
though.
Hard though.
No, it is.
The kids.
Right.
Like when they're in it, like I remember I made the mistake the first time I ever gave my child a smoothie. It was right before a flight, and it was the first time I was flying alone with like my 2-year-old. And man, she was she did not sit in her seat. I spent the whole trip being like, Ida. And when we left, everyone was like, bye, Ida. And I was like, oh my God.
So how can we keep up?
It's really hard.
I'm sorry. Yes, it's hard for us that are in the past that are not the parents. So wait, how could people keep up with follow your work and keep up with what you're doing, Dani and Coya?
Probably Instagram is the best. I'm at
nice.
Dani_McClain. I'm also on Twitter at Dr. McClain. Yeah, those are probably the best ways.
Nice. And Coya?
Yeah. Coya Paz at everything. Gmail, Yahoo, yes, Yahoo, Instagram.
AOL
I was like, girl, you gonna say Hotmail or what?
TikTok. My website, coyapaz.com. Like, it's just Coya. I'm so lucky nobody has a name. Nobody has my name, so I just have it for everything.
She's like, my MySpace. We thank you all, both of you, so much for being here. You guys are, you humans are fabulous, and we feel so lucky. If you got to log off, don't worry. And we're going to kick it to Jackie for our weekly updates, and then we'll follow up with Charles for the Rona reflection. You ready, Jax?
Yeah, I'm ready. So I want to talk about a couple of things that made national headlines this week. There was a shooting outside a funeral home in the South Side on 79th Street that injured 15 people. The cause isn't known, but funeral shootings have happened in Chicago before in Black and brown communities, and they tend to be gang related, at least on the surface. So by Chicago standards, what's most shocking is not that it happened at a funeral, but the number of people who were hurt. Because although shooters may be aiming at rivals, they are reckless about it, and they're probably using guns that are coming in from Indiana or other states. And then innocent family end up getting hurt. We need to find different ways to solve conflict, other avenues to let it out, places to hang out, to heal trauma, but that requires resources, right? It requires jobs, community spaces, well-funded schools, job training, college, etc., for our tax dollars to actually be put to work, and self-determination that comes from within the community. CPD was actually at the scene as everything was going down, and they didn't intervene. So as we know, they show up after the fact. There is like little to no prevention or de-escalation taking place during these incidents. So what is happening is that political opportunists like Trump are using these incidents to paint a grim picture of the inner city to his base and to rural and conservative voters. And he's talking about sending Homeland Security agents over here and to other blue states. And he said this before the funeral shooting. So he was reacting to the police confrontation in Grand Park on Friday at the Christopher Columbus statue, where CPD gassed people and broke a girl's teeth. The president of the cop union, the FOP, sent a letter to Trump asking for his intervention to deal with the protesters. Just like in Portland, where the feds have snatched people off the street in violation of their constitutional rights. This is already scaring the immigrant community who have been witness to the various departments and units that operate under Homeland Security, who walk around unidentified, drive unmarked vehicles, conduct overnight raids, and would amount to public kidnappings. And they also could potentially access a ton of your personal information from CPD databases and other databases. Or who knows, right? It would be impossible to tell if there is no oversight. Thankfully, thanks to activists, there is a sanctuary city ordinance that doesn't allow CPD to work with ICE. But Mayor Lightfoot is talking about welcoming the DEA, the FBI, the ATF. So what kind of protections should we expect for protesters and civilians to have? So honestly, there's a lot of things that happened this week that I could talk about, but I feel like I should leave everybody with these thoughts. Please check out the Southside Weekly.
Yes, check out the Southside Weekly. They also just shared some stuff about outside agitators on their page 3, talking exactly about federal agents coming in and just going ahead and checking out their work in general. And I'll let Charles close us out with the Rona reflection for this week.
Parenting is the first dynamic of power that each individual is born into. This dynamic has the potential to model liberation, freedom, the radical future informed by human care, or it can casually become a reproduction of the oppressive norms that we see today. But what exactly is radical parenting? From what I conclude, this is the explicit interrogation and commitment to practices that challenge status quo parenting for the goal of liberation for the individual, the family, and the community. We should model freedom in our homes the best way we can. There must be radical practices that are birthed in households. It can look like challenging and doing away with corporal punishment in the home to adopt better practices of care. It can look like providing children with the space and opportunity to develop who they are instead of trying to recreate smaller versions of ourselves, aiding their choice in becoming freer. I don't know why, but Gabrielle Union and Dwayne Wade both come to mind, and how there was social pressure for them to deny their daughter Zaya's wishes in truth. I know that parents and family are the foundation for community and therefore necessary in any liberatory struggle. I've known without community support, my parents wouldn't have been able to raise me into adulthood, and I can say the same for many others. People can have multiple parents, step parents, church parents, movement parents, relationships that extend beyond a biological tie, but can produce a dynamic that parallels the parental roles. I remember attending Chicago State University where I found my first Baba. Now, if you're unfamiliar to Black radical spaces, especially ones rooted in Afrocentrism, Baba is another word for father, but in this case, we're talking about male elders and patriarchs. These elders tend to hold wisdom and practice a more communal kinship to a community that is inherently disruptive to the status quo nuclear family, where we expect parents to have all the answers. Baba Kwesi built a fraternity of young Black men on the Roseland campus and called it Timbo, the key Swahili word for elephant. Every Thursday, we brothers would meet our Baba for history and cultural lessons. Beyond that, he would loan money, give us clothes, and always send us encouraging messages through the group me chat. Little means of inspiration that folks would definitely call Hotep. But that grounding, that dedication, and mainly his opposition to the status quo by extending his kinship network fortified students in their protest to save a university. Kwesi died not too long ago after we saved CSU. Rest in peace, Baba Kwesi. To me, that's radical parenting. I have no issue calling Kwesi my parent, but my mom taught me what freedom is. I remember in my early 20s where I had bouts with suicidal ideation and severe depression that led me to an episode where I actually contemplating ending it. Now, I believe most parents would try to dissuade their child from the ledge and remind them how important their life is. They would try to encourage them to think about what they're doing. However, my mom chose freedom. She told me with tears in her eyes to do as I wish, but to remember that I haven't spread my wings to fly and I have so much life left. She let me be the decider of my own fate without interruption. But in order to get to that point, she had to be comfortable with defying what the experts recommend she should say and trust her intuition and knowledge of her in knowing her middle child, trusting her son and liberating him with choice. Radical parenting, to put it succinctly, is freedom.
Let's give it up for Charles Alexander Preston. Got me a little bit emotional talking about all of that. And let's give it up for our guests, Dani and Coya Paz. Let's give it up to our girl, Jackie. She is back from Texas. She is here. She is self-quarantining. Everyone give some care reacts. We are so excited to follow our guests at Dani's social media. We will be sharing it in the comments. And you can also follow Coya Paz at all the Coya Paz things. And we'll definitely be, I'm already thinking about all the ways I want to try and bring them back on the show again in the future. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. This was a joy.
Yeah. Dani, I would literally just wanted to ask a question so bad about Cincinnati chili, but I'm gonna email you about it.
Yeah. I got opinions.